Well, Jim, we continue on here with the drive-thru with a big segment, something we've all been looking forward to, and that is a conversation with Tim Hornbaker about his brand new book, The Last Real World Champion, The Legacy of Nature Boy Ric Flair.
Well, that's right. And I've got to be honest, I've been waiting to do this for a while because Tim Hornbaker has written really the definitive history books of the modern era on professional wrestling, with the trilogy about the NWA, Capital Sports that became the WWF, and the death of the territories, and then, profiling Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. And now finally, this is the big one. And we have the man himself on the phone with us, direct from the safe part of Florida, Mr. Tim Hornbaker. Tim, thank you very much for being on the show today.
Well, thank you very much, Jim and Brian. I'm very humbled by your words. It is a true honor and a privilege to be with you gentlemen today.
I got to ask you, the thing that I'm most blown away by, before we talk about the Flair book in specific, is that your research is amazing. And it's obviously time consuming. It's got to be somewhat frustrating at various points, but it's so thorough. And you always, especially in your books, as I mentioned, on the NWA history and the formation of Capital Sports, the amount of material and places you have to go to get it that you've got to sift through to do something like that from that far back in history is how do you have the patience is my question.
It's something I think I've learned over time. I mean, I really love researching. Let me just put that out there. I really do love digging through the old documents and trying to find information that nobody's ever found before. And I think I got that bug probably 20, 25 years ago, and I still have it today. It's just something that drives me. I really do love sifting through court documents and newspapers, and I do, and I think another thing about it is that when I find a piece of information, even a small line in a column from 50 years ago, I have a kind of a system of organization where I'll tuck that away, and then later on I'll piece that in with other information. So I think it is kind of a system that I have built through the years, and I it's been a learned process. I've definitely struggled. I think in my NWA book, I've always said that if I could go back and do that book differently, I certainly would, and I would improve upon it. But I think at this stage of the game, I've gotten to a point where I can do these projects and take on so much information and then figure out a way to have a kind of a style and a narration where it's not an overburden, but it flows when you read it. So again, it's been a trial and error. I've definitely made my mistakes through the years and getting to the point where I am now. But it's definitely been a journey that I've enjoyed.
I've got to have you come up here and just organize my vault if you've got this system. I have probably every fact ever in wrestling, and I don't know where any of them are. But, that's the thing. You're very chronological. And you said that sometimes you find facts that nobody's ever known before. Actually, they've been there all the time. They weren't remembered or weren't important because people didn't know how to put them together. But when we go back and look at your books, especially me knowing somewhat, and Brian knowing somewhat about wrestling history anyway, things we read make more sense to us with this fact that you've written, because it applies to stuff we already know. Okay, that's why potentially Jack Pfeffer dressed the way he did, or whatever the case, right? And that's very helpful.
Absolutely. Yes.
And, you did the history of the promotions, and then you tackled Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, which was an amazing read because he was, not only an innovator in the business, but he was not only did Flair inherit a nickname and certain characteristics of the gimmick, he made it his own, but these two guys in their own separate generations were the ones who spawned so many fans that were wrestlers, that were in the business. The aficionados of Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, all the way from Ray Stevens to Jackie Fargo, and then the countless people that have emulated Ric Flair in some way or another. were they the two most prolific guys in the wrestling industry, maybe at spawning fans in the business who became imitators or homagers or whatever and carried their personalities into their own gimmicks more than anybody else ever?
They have to be. I mean, I agree with you. They really have just influenced so many different people who in turn have influenced people. I mean, if you even go to, look at, Ray Stevens, like you had mentioned, he was influenced by Buddy Rogers. And now how many people have been influenced by Ray Stevens? I mean, I think we're looking at a lineage of wrestling history
Flair.
here with these two guys. Yeah, exactly. Flair. So
Yeah.
So I mean, you look at this lineage and it keeps going. And I think a lot of younger guys today are still marveling at what Flair has done in his promos and his wrestling style. And they should. I mean, he has, and even Buddy Rogers, I mean, they can watch the videos and learn something about what he was able to do and what made him so successful. So I definitely agree with you.
But we talked about, Rogers here on the program a lot in that he kind of set the blueprint or the pattern for the modern style of match and the modern style in the TV era of the heel, the strutting, and he pulled my hair ref, and, didn't invent, maybe, depending on who you talk to, but certainly perfected the fucking high spot. One tackle, drop down, arm drag, body slam, drop kick, I'm taking a bump. That's what Rogers called them, sequences.
Definitely,
And,
yes.
Flair did not revolutionize the entire business in terms of coming up with something that elementary, because he came along later. It had already, all the really elementary stuff had already been done. But Flair built the modern blueprint of the world championship match. It wasn't the Dory and Briscoe and O'Connor style. It was a faster pace and maybe harder hitting, more strikes. And now, what Flair did night after night for those years as world champion is kind of the model for the modern world title match.
Absolutely. Ric Flair, I would say, revolutionized what it meant to be the world champion. And I think because he believed so much in it, he lived and breathed the world championship, but also he brought extreme conditioning and, his own flavor to the ring and even outside the ring, being the cocky, confident interview that he was. I mean, he was just the entire package, but night after night after night out there on the road, he really epitomized what the definition of a traveling world champion was. And he differed from Rogers and differed from Fez. And he just brought a new kind of style to it. And I think one of his real strengths was that he was able to match up against so many different guys out there of varying size and talent and still put on a good match. I mean, you left those arenas really wowed by Ric Flair. And in those days, if you read contemporaneous reports from fans, Flair was always beloved in those days for how hard he worked and what he gave night after night. So he really defined what it was to be the world champion, and there was no one else like him.
Well, and with Rogers, his personality during the 50s, it was kind of like, his heel persona, kind of like one of the wise guy gangsters in the gangster movies in the 40s, right? Hey, Pally. But that was contemporary at that time. And with Flair, when he was in the Carolinas in the mid-late 70s, except for the fact that he was 250 pounds, he looked like a guy that might be on stage at the Greensboro Coliseum in a fucking rock band. He was contemporary. So it was contemporary, two completely different images, but contemporary for their time. And that's a thing you cover Flair's life story, including incredible detail on his adoption that's been public knowledge and, some of his childhood school exploits, etc. But you could write a book on various parts of Ric Flair's life and, you could have a 7-volume set. I think you did a really good job balancing, you could write a book about his wrestling triumphs that only the wrestling fan would want to read. and leave out all the personal stuff. Or you could write, 2 books on the personal stuff, the good stuff, and then the modern day, the bad stuff, the financial scandals. You could cover all of that. You get everything in, you mention it, but it's neither a tabloid sleaze focus where everything's on his questionable antics, in modern times, or it's not just a fan publication where it's just all wrestling. You've kind of balanced the whole thing throughout as best you could in one book of 300 and some pages.
Jim, I really appreciate you saying that, really, really, because I really labored and struggled with this book. I mean, I knew that with Flair's wrestling career, if I was just writing about his wrestling career, I've done that before. I've written about people's wrestling careers and their achievements and their highs and lows in the ring and around the ring. I've done that. But with Flair, there was a whole nother dimension of his, like you said, his financial problems, his divorces, his, the plane ride from hell, all of these things that were compiling. And I knew about that going into this book. I knew that was going to be difficult, but the key was finding a balance in the narrative and keeping it unbalanced and independent as I do with my books. I wanted to write it in such a way where it didn't look like that I was defending Flair or I was hyping him up or anything. I wasn't trying to explain why he did what he did. I wanted to give readers, the information. I wanted to lay it out, and I wanted to do it in a thorough way, in a kind of a chronological order where, in the 70s, you see that he has financial problems. You see that he's traveling more and spending time with his family less. You see that, it looks like he's going to have a divorce. And, there's all of these things that are building up, and I have to do it intertwined with the wrestling stuff too, because that's the meat of the matter. I'm trying to combine this, and I'm telling you, it was not easy. So, for you to say that and mention that, I really appreciate that. And it was a difficult chore, and I just tried the best I could.
Well, I think a lot of and there's still a ton of the old Mid-Atlantic wrestling fans out there in the Carolinas that remember the 70s, but I think any wrestling fan, even people who weren't born in the 70s, one of the best parts about this book from the wrestling standpoint is you go into great detail with dates and crowds and quotes from newspaper articles on Flair's time in the Carolinas, from the time he started in 74 through when he first time as world champion in 81. That 7-year period, he went out to St. Louis and different places in Japan and etc. But he was the man in the Carolinas, and it also shows how popular the business was in that territory at that point in time. And the various huge names that Crockett kept in the territory, where you see Flair and Valentine as champions, wrestling the Andersons and all the top names of the NWA. And it's great that also that there was heavy newspaper coverage. I say heavy for wrestling. Heavy newspaper coverage in that territory, Charlotte Observer and the Raleigh paper, etc., because you've got stuff to look back on, and that was reported in instead of just in the arena programs. But with the Charlotte Observer article that you mentioned from 1976, Flair's earnings are quoted as like $125,000. A lot of people may think that's wrestling hyperbole, but I know for Dennis Condrey, from the time that we became partners in the Midnight Express, wanted to go to the Carolinas because he had been there early in his career and he'd been back and forth and he knew how much those guys were making. Even though he'd never been able to work there as a feature, he started out refereeing at, early in his career there. But those guys, Flair and Valentine, were having $2,000 and $3,000 weeks in 1976, 77 in a 3 or 4 state area, to the point where they would rent limousines to go to the fucking matches just to impress the fans. It was an incredible period, and you went into great detail with that. I think a lot of the modern fans that have just seen Flair on national TV from the late 80s and on might be thrilled to learn what a star he was and what level of business that the business was doing back at that point in time.
Yes, absolutely. The Mid-Atlantic region was the place to be, and I think that is why so many guys worked there and stayed there, because there was just so much money in Jim Crockett's territory. As you said, it was a multi-state area, and they worked, sometimes 7 days a week, and there was just a lot of money, and Flair was on top. I mean, once he got to the pinnacle of the region, the money to be made was astronomical. And I think he was asked at times, why didn't he travel more? And not only, the money was a great allure. I think he also loved the territory. He loved the people. He was had a great life there, and just the territory was thriving. And the money was amazing, and he really became a superstar. I mean, Flair really transitioned from being a rookie prelim guy and working at the bottom in the AWA to going to right on the doorstep of being a world champion. So he really thrived making money, but in the ring and as a personality, he really came into his own. And the Mid-Atlantic territory was a really booming place, and it was a lot of fun to research.
I can tell you firsthand, Flair loved the city of Charlotte. He loved the territory too, but he loved the city of Charlotte. I don't think he actually ever moved except when he had a spousal support issue and maybe wasn't persona non grata in North Carolina for a little while.
Yes, yeah.
But we all did, because it was such a great place, because there were other. I mean, no place that you could live in the Mid-South territory and still make all the towns was appealing to live in as a city. And, other territories were hit and miss, but the Carolinas, not only the quality of life, and Charlotte hadn't exploded yet like it has now, but it was still a good sized city, but also the way that the people, whether it be the newspapers, whether it be the radio and TV stations, or just the average people at the gas station and the average person on the street, they respected the wrestlers. They knew who they were. It wasn't, they didn't get a lot of shit for being wrestlers. It was a big deal in the Carolinas, and you were celebrities. And the heels still had heat and had problems, but overall, it wasn't like some of the other territories where a lot of people in town go, wrestling. It was a big deal. And that's why so many people, so many guys in the business not only wanted to work there because the money and the fact that it was the biggest NWA territory, but also it was just a good place to live, and you didn't catch a lot of shit.
Absolutely. And I think one of the keys is that, like, as you had mentioned earlier, the newspaper coverage, I think there was a lot of respect for wrestling. I think that the Crockett's had earned a lot of respect locally through different things in the community. And I think they had built wrestling up. While, again, it might not have been totally accepted, but it was treated with respect, as you said. And with a guy like Flair, who, and even all the guys, I mean, they really had a lot of esteem and respect. And it just, like you said, it was a booming territory. And
well, who was the guy from Channel 9? What was his name? Harold Johnson? When Flair made the helicopter.
That was.
Yeah, Flair made the entrance in the helicopter. It was one of the local news helicopters, and the local newscaster was in the fucking helicopter with him. And
absolutely,
Flair and those guys could call any radio station anytime they wanted, and they'd put them on the air. They had one of the local stations had me be a guest DJ when the regular morning team went on vacation one week, just because they were like, wrestlers were the celebrities in town. And Flair commanded that respect, not only just due to the Crockett, wrestling connection, but also every time one of these guys met him, he was putting the business over, and he was so professionally dressed, and he had the suit or the whatever the case. And you couldn't help but get caught up in the whole thing. And that's one thing that Flair morphed into his person. It was his personality, but morphed into the visual aspect of it. And I've always, joked that everybody else would be on the plane first thing in the morning from some town, sitting in their seat with their head down or holding their hands or their face or trying to go to sleep or whatever. And Flair would walk in the front door with the belt bag in one hand and his brush in the other, in a three-piece suit and the sunglasses, 6:30 in the morning, combing his hair and go, whoo, and he's ready to fucking go. It was demoralizing. How many stories did you get from people about his constitution? Arn Anderson used to say, he's not from here.
And it's true. I mean, it's really unbelievable how he would wrestle 60 minutes, party all night, be up at, the crack of dawn to work out and, be on his way to the next town. I mean, he really had a remarkable constitution, and I've never heard anyone in the business have anything like it. I mean, it's really astronomical what he was able to do. And I think that spoke to his longevity, and it also spoke to the fact that he loved the business, and that's the way he carried himself.
Yeah, the Terry Taylor story is hilarious, and I've seen other examples of this kind of in different places, but Terry Taylor was finally getting a push as a single in Mid-South, and he was going to get an NWA World title shot in the Superdome against Flair. This was 1985. And I remember the tape, Brian, you may remember this, the tape became widely collected and sought after. I think Joel Watts probably sent out the unedited version to some people. But it was a great fucking match, dark as shit, because they couldn't light the Superdome for television. But Flair came in like 2 hours before the show, heavily hungover. And Terry said he looked like he couldn't even open his eyes. And they said, do you want anything? He said, give me a cup of coffee. No, he said, I'm going to go take a nap. And he went and took a nap, and he got up like an hour later. He said, give me a cup of coffee. And Terry still not spoken to him, and they went over a couple of things and then went out and went 45 minutes or whatever it was. And Terry said that he almost fucking puked, and Flair would not stop. He would just, it was like nothing was wrong. Because when he turned it on, he turned it on.
He did. He was like a machine, and it's really just unbelievable what he was able to do and how he was able to transition between all these facets of his life. And he could go from one gear to the other. And when it was time to step into the ring and perform before an audience, he was the professional, he was the nature boy, and he let it all fly.
You've got tons of the results of his major matches in here and dates and etc. But they've put out on Twitter occasionally one or two of the old NWA World Champion schedules for 1983, I think, is the period of time Flair had it. They put that out on Twitter here lately, where you see that there were literally no days off for a month or 6 weeks at a time, and then you'd get one or two or whatever, or they'd be in a territory for 4 or 5 days like the Carolinas, but in the middle of it, he'd have to shoot down to Texas or up to St. Louis to make a shot or whatever. I wonder, is there any way of calculating in the main world title years what kind of mileage Flair may have traveled in just a month's period of time? Because I know I used to keep ours because we were in a car all the time, but he was in a plane every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the book I do calculate one of his journeys, but I know it was there were times where he had stretches where it was easily tens of thousands of miles across the United States, and then shooting. I think on one time he was in Charlotte and then had to go to Tokyo. And I mean, the trips back and forth were continuous. And within a month's time, I mean, easily, I would say 50,000 miles. I mean, it's really hard to calculate, but the amount of mileage that he was doing on a consistent basis was like nothing that none of his predecessors had dealt with. And like we said, I mean, his constitution to deal with that was just remarkable.
Well, we've talked on this show about a double shot he did one time where they accidentally double booked him. He was in Raleigh, North Carolina for an 8:00 show and Tampa, Florida for an 8:30 show, courtesy of a private plane and people stalling down south in Florida so he could make both commitments. That's got to be some kind of Fucking one-day record.
I heard about that, Jim, and that was probably one of the most crazy things that I heard of. I actually contacted one of my fellow historians here in Florida to confirm that actually happened. And he said, yeah, for sure enough, that did. And I was amazed. Yeah, Flair.
All the boys that night in the Dorton Arena in the back, when they put Flair on second, we're dying laughing because there's the guy with the car at the back door. As soon as Flair, he's not even going to go back in the locker room. The guy's got his bag. He's going to jump in the car in his tights and go to the airport in Raleigh to take off in the private plane to get to fucking Tampa in time where somebody's going to pick him up there and get him, hustle him in the ring by 11 o'clock or whatever. And I mean, that was not even a strictly a double shot, because a double shot in wrestling terminology is an afternoon and evening show. That was just ridiculous. It was a mistake that he was able to fucking do. But I mean, Crockett booked this one time, Flair on top, a double shot in Greensboro, North Carolina at 2 o'clock, and Albuquerque, New Mexico at 8 o'clock their time, Mountain Time. And Flair made both of those, as along with the rest of us, but he was in the main event of the fucking thing. But this one was even tighter.
It's incredible. I mean, what he was able to pull off. And I think when Jim Barnett was booking the title before it became exclusive to Crockett, I think Barnett tried to work with him at times, but with the demanding NWA promoters as they were, they always wanted to slip in an extra date here and there. And like you said, Flair was able to meet those commitments even in spite of ridiculous travel and hustling and to his own peril at times, times that maybe he wasn't able to go home or be with his family. He was back on the road making another date.
And well, Brian, I know you might have some, I know you wanted to talk about New Zealand, but also what are we not discussing in the career of the Nature Boy here while we got Tim on the phone?
Yeah, a few questions. Tim, in the process of researching this book, how many times did Ric Flair expose his penis to you?
Hey!
This is a safe space. You could talk about it here.
All right. I think I'm going to need some therapy after this. Let's not go down
Brian,
that road,
he thought he saw it one time, but it was really just a baby's arm holding an apple.
Well, all kidding aside, the Buddy Rogers book is such an amazing piece of work. I mean, beyond just the book, the research, it taught so many of us so much more about Buddy Rogers than we ever knew. And you go from Nature Boy Buddy Rogers to Nature Boy Ric Flair. Buddy Rogers, unfortunately, no longer here. There was no one for you to talk to. If he was here, you don't have any guarantee he would have broken kayfabe or talked to you about any of this stuff. With Ric Flair, was there any cooperation, and do you think you needed cooperation from Ric Flair?
That's a great question. I think in the very beginning, there was a thought process that having Flair's involvement to some degree, just to get some of the harder questions answered, would be a good idea. I actually discussed this with my editor, and I did a lot of thinking about it. And with my previous books, even though, this is the first individual that I've written about in a biography form that is still alive, I think it was important to me to maintain an unbiased and independent research tact going into the book. And I think that was my goal from beginning to end. And once I had made the decision, that was what I focused on, just trying to find independent sources and to utilize information from even old interviews. But I really wasn't getting a biased look. I wasn't getting I wasn't putting out what Flair had said in his autobiographies and whatnot. I was kind of doing the independent research, and I think that was the decision I made, and that's what I went forward doing.
For you, do you enjoy the process of researching a subject better than an overall topic? Because again, as Jim mentioned earlier, you did the 3 books about the history of modern American wrestling, if you really want to put it that way, the NWA, Titan Sports, everything, and of course the Death of the Territories. But now you've done Buddy Rogers, now you've done Ric Flair. What do you prefer? Do you prefer a biography, or do you prefer an individual topic or a series of topics, an overall theme?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that at this stage, I really do enjoy writing biographies. I mean, I like getting into, focusing on a subject matter and really trying to immerse myself in their life and learning about everything that they have done and really getting to the core of a subject. And I actually have written several books on some baseball players as well, Ty Cobb, Shoeless Joe Jackson. And I think I got the bug when I wrote those books, and then it transitioned to, of course, my book on Buddy Rogers, which I loved working on. It was just a book where I could just, you really want to learn everything you can about that individual. And the same went with this Ric Flair book, and it presents challenges, of course. It's maybe writing about a subject matter or a theme, you could do things a little bit differently. But with a biography, there are certain rules and guidelines that you kind of have to follow. But I really enjoy doing that. And, it was something that I really, I felt that I could do well and present the story, and I enjoy doing.
Hey, Tim, you glossed over something a second ago, but you did write a book on Shoeless Joe Jackson for all the wrestling but non-baseball fans out there, the 1919 Black Sox scandal. Brian, I know that's something near and dear to your heart, but I saw the book, read the book, and even though I'm not a baseball aficionado, it's a scandal. It has organized crime, it has victims, it has pathos, it has everything. That was a great book too. So you're not just plumbing the wrestling well. You're going for all the sports.
Hey Tim,
Thank you, Jim.
Hey Tim, should Shoeless Joe Jackson be in the Hall of Fame?
Big part of me says yes. Big part of me says that he really was I want to say, and do this delicately, his education wasn't the best. He wasn't the smartest guy. I think he got roped into something that he probably realized later that he was in over his head, but I think his baseball statistics stand for themselves, and I think he should definitely be given consideration.
Well, there you go.
Well, is that what you wanted to hear, Brian?
I wanted to hear his answer.
The Shoeless Joe charge?
I am not leading the charge, and I will not give my thoughts on this matter. I don't want to sway any of the potential voters out there. But
did grandfather Last lose any money in that scandal?
No, he had nothing to do with that. Rothstein, you have to talk to. Tim, the book goes into a lot of detail about WCW in the 90s, specifically when Ric Flair returned. They really needed him. He got along with Bischoff early on. He's the one who connected Bischoff with Hogan. He was booking right when things started to at least creatively turn around, if not. He was also doing the house shows when the house show business started turning around, him and Randy Savage. But during that period of time, Ric Flair's talked about having confidence issues. We all know the stories of the way Bischoff degraded him in front of the locker room. There were lawsuits. Your research and everything you looked at in putting this book together, what can you say about Ric Flair's importance to WCW in the 90s?
Well, he was the backbone. I mean, there was a lot of guys like Sting and that were really the foundation of the company. I think Ric Flair was just one of the key players throughout that time period, in spite of the fact that when Hogan came aboard, he was kind of pushed aside, and there was a kind of a transition to this new kind of basis for what they were building the promotion around. But even so, even all the times they buried Flair with the wacky angles and the forced retirement, and then even after he had the issue with Bischoff and came back, they did a heart attack angle, and he was in the mental hospital for a while. I think the ratings at the time always reflected a spike when Flair was on TV, and even though they wanted to build this new blood and they wanted to build up the younger talent, Flair was always consistent. He was a consistent draw. And I feel like had they just utilized him correctly, he would have been an aid in building and turning things around. But instead, they were just destined to fail, and they continuously ran these angles that didn't make any sense, and they were hurting Flair rather than utilizing them to the best of their ability. It's amazing that he was able to get through this, and it is completely understandable that he had self-confidence issues because of just the way he was being used. And for a legend like him at the time, there were much better ways to utilize him.
Hey, Tim, have you noticed in doing research on so many books of wrestling history from the 30s on up, and then somewhat of modern day, as you were mentioning, the 90s and on, those kind of things started happening when it moved away from the guy who made the creative decisions. Also, the money was coming straight out of his pocket or going straight into his pocket. When it became the guys making the creative decisions were getting paid like everybody else, and it didn't matter what the bottom line was, you got shit like, well, we don't care if he does ratings, we're going to bury him in the desert.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's one of the weird things about professional wrestling and its evolution is that some of these guys throughout history have attained power, and with the ego and the power struggle, I would say that the wrestling has suffered, and wrestling fans have suffered as a result. I mean, what could have been, what should have been, why didn't this happen? I mean, how many times have we looked back at wrestling history and these major moments where things could have, the spike of wrestling's popularity in the late 90s? I mean, how can they destroy that? How did they ruin what was something that was so great and turn it into, just destroy wrestling's value at that point? There was a money value there. I mean, you really found a way to turn away what was a new golden age. And yeah, it was all the bad decision making and power plays and egos, and it's just I still can't understand it.
Hey, Tim, what would have happened if Jim had been able to get Ric Flair into the building that time for the WWF pay-per-view in Charlotte?
Well, I think a lot of heads would have exploded. I think it would have been an amazing for some instances, but I think Flair probably would have paid the price on the other end. But I think I think Jim was going in the right direction. I think that would have been a great thing for wrestling at the time, at least.
Well, see, we had a loophole in that I can't remember exactly now. It's been almost 30 years, but what Ric's contract status was, you may know better than I. That was the period of time he was on the outs. It was the pay-per-view in Greensboro, North Carolina that the WWE did where it had been 12 years since Starrcade 86, and we finally beat the gate record that we had set there. But the deal was Reed had just won that grade school wrestling tournament, right? He was still in grade school at that point in time, right? In 1998?
Yeah. And he won some sort of amateur title, yeah.
And what was going to happen was that after one of the matches, suddenly people would see Ric Flair and his son Reed walk into the arena and come sit in the front row, and the announcers would say, well, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a wrestling champion from the state of North Carolina that has just joined us, and we'd like to interview him here right now. And they'd go and they'd interview Reed with Rick sitting right next to him, not saying a fucking word. That was the idea.
Yeah, that would have been classic. I mean, yeah.
And so what was Flair's attorney at the time? Was that when he was using John Taylor?
I believe so, yeah.
Troy and Taylor in Atlanta?
Yeah, but exactly.
So the deal was I was in Vince's office in the Greensboro Coliseum. Vince couldn't get on the phone because he wasn't going to plausible deniability. He's not talking to Ric Flair, right? Now I'm talking to my friend Ric Flair that I talk to on a regular basis, who's circling the Greensboro Coliseum in the limo with the fucking phone in the limo back when they had those, talking to alternately me and John Taylor in Atlanta about whether or not he should actually go in and do it. And then finally they say, we think you might be okay, but it might not be worth it. And they turned around and went back to Charlotte. I was like, Newman.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of heads would have exploded for sure had you gotten that one. And it would have been a classic moment for wrestling. I think there was a lot on the line, but that would have been a beautiful scenario for sure.
Tim, is there anything you really wanted to know that you couldn't find out, or anything that, now that the book has been published, just continues to frustrate you, or just something that in your research you couldn't come to an answer on?
That is a really great question. To be honest, I'm going to say that I really got fortunate with this book that due to the pandemic, there was a lot of trouble getting court documents. And I knew getting certain court documents out of the state of North Carolina were imperative to my research. I mean, they were just I needed to bounce things off them. I needed to find dates. I needed to find the exact wording of certain situations. And it was impossible to get court documents during the pandemic. And once once the courthouses started opening up and they started to kind of lighten up on the rules and the regulations that they had, these stringent rules that they had in place, I at the last minute, within 3 months of my book being due, I was able to get probably 2,000 court documents out of Mecklenburg. And one of the documents was the divorce records from his first wife with Leslie. And within that opened up a whole floodgate of new information I did not have, financial records, information about his tax debt at the time. I would say that I was very lucky to get that at the last second, because had I not achieved that, and I say it achieved because it was a big success for me, had I not gotten that, I think the book would have been very different. I think I would have been at a big loss for a lot. So I think I lucked out, and again, luck is a imperative word there. But I really was able to get what I needed to close this book up and finish it the right way.
Back to you, Jim.
Back to me? I was engrossed in the questions Brian was asking you. Well, speaking of wrapping up the book in the right way, it is The Last Real World Champion, The Legacy of Nature Boy Ric Flair. It's by Tim Hornbaker. It is published by ECW Press. Don't let the name fool you, folks. Heyman's got nothing to do with it. Tim, you can... Obviously, this book is out now, correct? Has it been released, or it's about to be released?
It's going to be formally. I think some people have gotten deliveries. I don't know how, but it's supposed to be formally released on September 12th. So it's definitely a couple days off, but it's coming out very soon.
And where can they, again, I've said this so many times, there's so many great books about wrestling, and so many different people have written about this territory or that star. But if you want to know the history of professional wrestling, at least in the United States, your trilogy, the NWA, Capital Sports, and Death of the Territories, is the place to start. Where do they get those, if those are still available?
Jim, I appreciate that. Yes, you can probably still pick them up at any major bookseller, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or you can go to ecwpress.com. Those books should be readily available. And yes, I appreciate your words, Jim.
And if you can ever find a box or two that falls off the truck, I'll be glad to put them up at jimcornette.com. But I don't want to mess with the big boys.
I would love to work with you on that. That would be an honor. That would be great. We could figure that out.
And I'll give you at least 10% of all your business. Anyway, Brian, I was about to say, Brian, close her up.
Hey, Tim, what are you working on next?
Well, I kind of have a big exclusive for you, gentlemen, today. At this stage of any project, I usually I'm thinking about my next book and got my head trying to figure out what is going to be my next project. For me personally, though, the last few years have been very challenging, and I've dealt with some serious health issues that have kind of set me back a little bit. So this announcement that I kind of want to say that I'm going to step back from writing and research for a little while to kind of focus more on my family and my health. And I'm not saying that this is a retirement or anything. I'm just saying that for the time being, I'm gonna take a little time to rebuild and to recover a little bit. And I think there will be another book on the horizon, but for the time being, I think I just need some time off.
Well, you didn't clear this with me, Tim. And as a selfish prick, and speaking for another selfish prick in Brian, just your health and your family is nowhere near as important as our knowledge and enjoyment.
This is a great negotiating tactic, Tim.
Get well and happy soon and hurry back is all we've got to say, because we can't do without these books for the rest of our life. We learn so much about wrestling from these books.
That's right.
Thank you so much, guys. And I appreciate all the support. You guys have been great and always, made time for me and always had a kind word. I really appreciate it. And I do look forward to coming back. I do have some ideas, but like I said, first things first. And when I do make my big announcement for my next book, I definitely will give it to you, gentlemen.
In the meantime, kayfabe the 4-part series on the Midnight Express and Jim Cornette till later on. We have an official launch.
I got you, Jim, for sure.
Well, gentlemen, with that, we'll return to the drive-thru after this short commercial timeout.